The archive of Prime floated in the cold darkness between stars, a massive station that held the memory of 4,000 civilizations. Its halls stretched for kilometers, filled with data crystals that glowed with soft blue light. Every treaty, every war, every discovery made by the Galactic Concordat rested here in perfect silence. Walked these halls alone, her footsteps echoing against the metal floor. She was young by her people's standards, barely 200 years old, with silver scales that caught the dim light as she moved. Her species, had long served as the keepers of history. They believed that memory was sacred, that nothing should ever be forgotten. But tonight had found something that challenged that belief. She stood before a data terminal, her four-fingered hands moving across the holographic display. The records she had discovered made no sense. Entire sections of the oldest files had been deleted, leaving gaps in the timeline that spanned thousands of years. Where there should have been detailed accounts of early galactic contact, she found only empty space and strange warning symbols. The symbol appeared again and again. It looked like a circle with a line through it, and her translation software struggled to interpret it. The closest meaning it could find was the unmade, or perhaps those who were removed. Her hearts beat faster as she dug deeper. She found fragments of text that had survived the deletion, broken sentences that hinted at something terrible. One fragment read, "Their persistence cannot be measured by conventional means." Another said, "Adaptation rate exceeds all known parameters." A third, partially corrupted, simply stated, "They do not stop." She was so focused on her work that she did not hear the footsteps behind her. "You should not be looking at those files." Spun around, her scales flashing with alarm. Elder stood in the doorway, his ancient body bent with age. He was the oldest of the archivists, a being who had served this station for 300 years. His eyes, clouded with time, still held a sharp intelligence. Elder said, "I found something wrong with the records. There are gaps, deletions. Someone removed entire sections of our history." Walked slowly into the room. His tail dragged against the floor, leaving a faint trail in the dust that gathered in these forgotten sections. "I know," he said simply. "You know," stared at him. "But that violates everything we stand for. The archive exists to preserve truth. Who would do this? Why?" The old archivist stopped beside her and looked at the display. When he saw the symbol, the circle with the line through it, his entire body began to shake. It was not anger, realized with shock that it was fear. "Some knowledge is forbidden," said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Not because it is false, but because it is dangerous." "I do not understand." Moved to a chair and lowered himself into it, as if his legs could no longer support him. The Galactic Concordat was founded 10,000 years ago. 4,000 species signed the original charter, agreeing to work together for peace and prosperity. Do you know what the first and only unanimous clause in that charter was? Shook her head. No member world may contact, study, or acknowledge the existence of a quarantined system on the galaxy's outer arm. The coordinates are sealed. The records are sealed. Even speaking of this is forbidden. Looked up at her with something like despair in his ancient eyes. "And yet here you are, digging up the past." "What is in that system?" asked. "What could possibly frighten 4,000 species into agreeing to forget something existed?" Was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of centuries. "They called themselves humans. They came from a small planet orbiting a yellow star. When our ancestors first encountered them, they seemed unremarkable. Fragile bodies, short, limited natural abilities. Many species dismissed them as insignificant." "What happened?" "They refused to stop." Hands trembled. "When we tried to limit their expansion, they adapted to our weapons. When we released plagues designed to contain them, they developed immunities within generations. When we destroyed their ships, they built new ones. When we killed millions, billions more kept coming. They did not surrender. They did not negotiate. They simply kept growing, kept learning, kept surviving." felt cold spread through her body. They were conquerors. No, shook his head. That is what made them so terrifying. They were not trying to destroy us. They were simply trying to live. But their drive to survive, to expand, to overcome every obstacle was so powerful that it threatened to consume everything in its path, not through malice but through sheer, unstoppable persistence. So we fought them. We tried. For 2,000 years, the combined might of the early Concordat tried to stop them. We failed. Every strategy, every weapon, every alliance we formed broke against their determination. They learned faster than we could adapt. They recovered from losses that would have ended any other species. Stood and walked to the window looking out at the stars. In the end, our founders realized the truth. We could not defeat the humans. We could only contain them. So we trapped them in their home systems, sealed the borders, and agreed to forget they existed. We hoped that isolation would accomplish what warfare could not. We hoped that if we ignored them long enough, they would simply fade away. But they did not, said understanding now. We do not know, admitted. The quarantine has held for 8,000 years. No one goes in, nothing comes out. The coordinates are removed from every star chart. Children are not taught that humans ever existed. In time, we believed even the memory of them would disappear. Looked back at the corrupted files. Then why are you telling me this? Before could answer, an alarm began to sound throughout the station. Red lights flashed in the corridor outside. Checked her terminal and felt her blood turn to ice. An unregistered vessel, she read. It is broadcasting from inside the quarantine zone. Gripped her arm with surprising strength. That is not possible. Nothing survives in the quarantine zone. The automated defenses. The defenses have been destroyed, interrupted, reading the incoming data. The vessel is moving toward Concordat space. It is broadcasting a message. She brought up the transmission. Static filled the air, followed by a voice speaking in a language that her software struggled to translate. The words were ancient, barely recognizable, but the meaning came through clearly. We remember. Sank back into his chair, his face pale. They survived. After 8,000 years in isolation, they survived. What do we do? Asked. I do not know. The old archivist stared at the display, watching the small dot that represented the vessel move slowly through space. For 8,000 years, we told ourselves they were gone. We convinced ourselves that the quarantine had worked. We built our entire civilization on the foundation of forgetting them. He turned to look at, and for the first time, she saw not fear in his eyes but something else. Something that looked almost like acceptance. Now the forbidden species returns, and we must face what our ancestors could not. We must face the truth we tried so hard to erase. Paused, his voice dropping to a whisper. We must face the humans. Outside the window, the stars continued their eternal dance, indifferent to the small dramas of mortal beings. But somewhere in that vast darkness, a ship was moving, carrying with it the survivors of a species that the galaxy had tried to forget. They had not forgotten. They had only been waiting. The Emergency Council met in the Great Hall of Prime, a chamber designed to hold representatives from 1,000 worlds. Today, every seat was filled. Species that had not spoken to each other in centuries gathered together, united by a fear that transcended their differences. Stood at the back of the hall, watching as the leaders argued. In the center of the chamber, a holographic display showed the human vessel as it moved through space. It had made no aggressive moves. It had not fired weapons or threatened anyone. It simply continued forward, broadcasting that same two-word message. We remember. High Chancellor, a massive creature with 6 legs and a body covered in thick armor plating, called the assembly to order. We have confirmed the reports, he announced, his voice echoing through the hall. A vessel has emerged from the quarantine zone. Analysis indicates it is of human origin. A wave of murmurs swept through the crowd. Many of the younger representatives looked confused. They had never heard the word human before. The memory had been erased so completely that entire generations had grown up without knowing the species existed. For those who are unfamiliar, continued, the humans are a species that was contained 8,000 years ago. They were considered too dangerous to exist alongside the Concordat. The decision to quarantine them was unanimous. "What do they want?" someone called out. "We do not know. The vessel has requested formal diplomatic contact. Its captain identifies herself as." Listened as the council debated. Some called for immediate military action. Others argued for caution. A few suggested simply ignoring the vessel and hopping it would go away. But everyone agreed on one thing: the humans were a threat that needed to be addressed. After hours of discussion, the council reached a decision. They would send a delegation to meet with the human vessel. The goal was to assess the threat and determine whether the quarantine could be reestablished. No one spoke of peace. No one mentioned the possibility that the humans might not be enemies. Was surprised when she received orders to join the delegation. As a junior archivist, she had no experience in diplomacy or military matters, but she was one of the few beings in the Concordat who had actually studied the ancient human records. Her knowledge, limited as it was, made her valuable. The delegation traveled in a heavily armed cruiser, surrounded by warships that bristled with weapons. As they approached the human vessel, studied it through the viewport. It was massive, larger than anything the Concordat had built. Its hull was covered in strange symbols and patterns that she did not recognize. "It is a generation ship," one of the scientists explained. "Designed for long-distance travel. Based on its design, it must have been launched before the quarantine was established." "They have been traveling for 8,000 years?" asked. "It appears so. The humans inside must be descendants of the original crew. They have lived their entire existence on that ship." The docking procedure was tense. Armed soldiers lined the corridor as the airlock opened, their weapons pointed at the entrance. What emerged was not what anyone expected. Was a small creature, barely reaching shoulder. She had smooth skin the color of dark wood and hair that fell in tight curls around her face. She wore a simple uniform with no weapons visible. Behind her stood a small group of humans, all of them watching the Concordat soldiers with curious rather than hostile eyes. "Thank you for meeting with us," said. Her translator device converted her words into the common language. "We have been traveling for a very long time. We are glad to finally meet our neighbors." The delegation leader, a stern diplomat named, stepped forward. "You understand that your presence here is a violation of Concordat law. Your species was quarantined for a reason." Tilted her head, a gesture that seemed to indicate confusion. "Quarantined. We did not know anyone was out here. We thought the galaxy was empty. That is why we left Earth to find new worlds to settle." "You expect us to believe you knew nothing of the quarantine?" "How could we? We launched our ship 10,000 years ago. We have had no contact with anyone outside our vessel in all that time." Spread her hands in a gesture of openness. "We did not even know other intelligent species existed until we reached this region of space." Watched the exchange carefully. She could see no deception in the human's eyes, no hidden malice in her words. Either was telling the truth, or she was a far better liar than anyone had ever met. The delegation toured the human ship. What they found challenged everything they had been taught. The humans had built a functioning civilization inside their vessel. They had schools, hospitals, farms, and factories. They had art and music and literature. They had developed technologies that the Concordat had abandoned as too dangerous, including methods of faster-than-light travel that should have been impossible. But they had also preserved their history. In the ship's archive found records of everything, every war humanity had fought, every atrocity they had committed, every dark chapter of their past. Nothing was hidden or erased. The humans remembered everything, both good and bad. "Why do you keep these records?" asked as they walked through the archive. "Some of this history is terrible. Do you not want to forget?" Was quiet for a moment. "My people have learned that forgetting is dangerous. When we forget our mistakes, we repeat them. When we hide from our darkness, it grows stronger." She looked at with eyes that seemed older than her young face. "We remember so that we might one day overcome our nature. We document our failures so that our children might succeed where we did not. Our records say your species nearly destroyed the galaxy." "We nearly destroyed ourselves," corrected. "Many times. We have a capacity for violence that frightens even us, but we also have a capacity for growth, for change, for becoming better than we were." She smiled, a strange expression that seemed to soften her features. "We are not the same species we were 10,000 years ago. We have evolved. We have learned." When the delegation returned to the Concordat, they were divided. Some, believed that the humans had changed. Others argued that this was simply a new strategy, that a species which could not be defeated had simply learned to appear harmless. The council debated for days. Maintain the quarantine and risk war with a civilization that had only grown stronger in isolation, or end the silence and welcome back the species their ancestors had feared so deeply they chose to forget. As the arguments continued, found herself thinking about words. The humans remembered their darkness. They did not hide from it or pretend it did not exist. Perhaps that was why they had survived so long. Perhaps that was why they had grown strong. The Concordat had chosen to forget its own dark history. It had erased the humans and pretended they never existed. But forgetting had not made the fear go away. It had only pushed it into the shadows, where it waited for the day when the truth could no longer be. That day had finally arrived, and now the galaxy would have to decide what kind of future it wanted to build, one based on fear and forgetting, or one based on truth, no matter how painful that truth might be. The war fleet assembled at the edge of human space, thousands of ships from hundreds of worlds. They represented the largest military force the Concordat had gathered in 5,000 years. Their weapons could shatter planets. Their soldiers numbered in the billions. Stood on the bridge of the flagship, watching the armada take formation. She had been assigned as an advisor to the fleet commander, her knowledge of human history deemed valuable in the coming conflict. But she felt no pride in her position. She felt only a deep, growing dread. "The humans have refused to return to the quarantine zone," the fleet commander announced. "They claim they have done nothing wrong and will not be imprisoned for crimes they did not commit. The Council has authorized military action." Around, officers prepared for battle. But she could not stop thinking about what she had seen on the human ship. The schools where children learned to be kind. The hospitals where the sick were healed. The archives where every mistake was preserved so it would not be repeated. These were not monsters. These were people who had built something remarkable in the darkness of space, alone and forgotten for 8,000 years. "I need to return to the archive," said suddenly. "There is something I must verify before the attack begins." The commander looked at her with irritation. "This is not the time for research, archivist." "Please," met his eyes. "If I am wrong, it will change nothing, but if I am right, it could change everything." Something in her voice must have convinced him. He granted her access to a small ship, and she flew back to Prime as fast as the engines would allow. The archive was quiet when she arrived. Elder had died shortly after the human vessel appeared, his ancient body finally giving out under the weight of fear and revelation. Walked the halls alone, searching through files that had not been accessed in. She found what she was looking for in the deepest section of the archive, in records so old that the data crystals had begun to decay. The files described an event that had occurred 10,000 years ago, before the quarantine was established, before the Concordat even existed. It was called the Hollow Tide. The records were fragmentary but pieced together the story. The hollow tide was an anomaly, a rift in space that consumed everything in its path. It appeared without warning and began spreading across the galaxy, destroying star systems by the dozens. The early species that would later form the Concordat had no defense against it. They were facing extinction. And then the humans volunteered. Read the ancient accounts with growing amazement. When no other species would act, the humans had offered to fly ships into the heart of the anomaly. They knew they would not survive, but they also knew that by transmitting data from inside the rift, they could help the other species develop countermeasures. Thousands of human ships had flown into the hollow tide. They had broadcast information until their vessels were torn apart by forces beyond understanding. They had died screaming, one after another, buying time with their lives for people they had never met. And they had succeeded. The data they provided allowed the surviving species to develop a weapon that closed the rift. The galaxy was saved. The Concordat was formed in celebration of this victory. But the founders had not celebrated the humans. Found the records of what happened next, and her heart broke as she read them. The surviving humans had expected gratitude. Instead, they received fear. The other species looked at the humans and saw a people who would fly into certain death without hesitation. They saw a persistence that could not be explained, a determination that bordered on madness. The founders told themselves that such a species was too dangerous to exist freely. They convinced themselves that the humans who had saved them were a threat that needed to be contained. And so they established the quarantine, not as a reward for sacrifice, but as a punishment for being too brave, too stubborn, too human. They had sent humanity to die, promised them gratitude, and then sealed them away when their resilience proved too uncomfortable a reminder of their own cowardice. The records and flew back to the fleet at maximum speed. She arrived just as the first shots were being fired. "Stop!" she screamed across every channel, broadcasting the archived files to every ship in the Armada. "Stop the attack! Look at what I have found!" The battle paused as commanders across the fleet reviewed the ancient records. Silence fell over the communication channels. Then, slowly, the shooting stopped. Addressed the fleet, her voice shaking with emotion. "We did not quarantine the humans because they were monsters. We quarantined them because they were heroes. They saved us from the hollow tide, and we repaid them with imprisonment and forgetting. We erased their sacrifice because we were ashamed of our own fear." The reaction was immediate and divided. Some ships began pulling back from the battle line. Others remained in formation, their commanders unwilling to accept that everything they believed was a lie. The Concordat, united by fear of the humans, began to fracture. On the human flagship received the broadcast, watched through a communication link as the human captain read the ancient records. His face went through a series of emotions: confusion, then understanding, then a deep and profound sadness. "My ancestors died to save you," said quietly, "and you erased their memory." "Yes," felt tears streaming down her scaled face. "We wronged you terribly. I do not know if forgiveness is possible, but I needed you to know the truth." Was silent for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice was steady. "My people have spent 8,000 years learning to remember. We remember our own crimes, our own failures, our own darkness, but we also remember how to forgive." She looked directly through the communication link. "We do not want revenge. We do not want reparations. We want only what we have always wanted: to reach out, to connect, to belong. Your ancestors feared us for our persistence. Perhaps now your generation can learn to depend on it." The war fleet dispersed. Over the following months, the quarantine was officially lifted. The truth about the hollow tide spread across the Concordat, and species began to reckon with what their ancestors had done. Some rejected the revelation, clinging to their fear, but many more opened their hearts to the humans who had saved them so long ago. 1 year later, the first human ambassador addressed the Galactic Concordat. stood before representatives of 4,000 worlds, a small figure in a vast chamber filled with beings who had once tried to forget her species existed. "We are not perfect," she said. "We never claimed to be. We carry darkness within us, a capacity for violence and destruction that we must constantly struggle against. But we also carry light. We carry hope. We carry the stubborn, unshakable belief that tomorrow can be better than today." She paused, looking out at the assembled representatives. "You feared us because we would not stop. You sealed us away because our persistence frightened you. But perhaps the galaxy needs a species that refuses to stop, not as conquerors, but as the ones who run toward disaster when everyone else flees, as the ones who remember when others choose to forget." Smiled the same strange expression that had softened her features when first met her. "We remember everything, the good and the bad, the light and the dark, and we choose every day to reach for the light. That is what it means to be human." In the audience, watched as representatives from across the galaxy rose to their feet. The applause began slowly, tentatively, and then grew into a thunder that shook the walls of the great chamber. The forbidden species had returned, and this time they would not be forgotten.